So on behalf of the Baha'i Chair for Studies in Development, I would like to warmly welcome our distinguished speaker for today's session, Professor Mihir Shah, and all our participants who are joining us on this Zoom webinar, as well as on our Facebook live feed. This lecture is part of a series of lectures being organized by the Baha'i Chair titled Dialogues on Development. And this particular lecture by Professor Shah is on the theme of policy and practice informed by the ancient science of spirituality. I don't think Professor Shah requires an introduction, but as a matter of protocol, we introduce our speaker for the session. Professor Mihir Shah is a renowned economist and distinguished professor and chair Rural Management Program at Shiv Nadar University. He is one of India's leading scholars, activists, and policymakers on water management and rural livelihoods. From 2009 to 2014, he was a member Water Resources of the Planning Commission, Government of India, and was chiefly responsible for drafting the paradigm shift in the management of water resources enunciated in the 12th five-year plan. From 2019 to 21, he chaired the Government of India's committee to draft the new national water policy. In 1990, he co-founded Samaj Pragati Sahyog, which is today one of the largest grassroots initiatives for water and livelihood security, working with its partners on 1 million acres of land across 72 of India's most backward districts. Professor Shah has spent nearly 3 decades living and working in central India, forging a new paradigm of inclusive and sustainable development. I won't take more time. I'll let Professor Shah introduce the theme and, of course, to take us through his presentation. But just before we start, for the participants, we will have time at the end of the session for approximately 15 to 20 minutes to take your questions and comments. So please post your comments in the Q&A box, and we will take them up with Professor Shah at the end. Over to you, Professor Shah.
Thank you so much, Arash. I'll just share my screen. I hope you're able to see it, and I can make it full screen. So is that okay? All clear? You can hear me, see me, and see the presentation? Okay, so a lot of people have also put in a request that मुझे हिंदी में भी बोलना चाहिए, तो मैं प्रयास करूंगा. समय की सीमा है. अरश ने अभी आपको बताया कि मुझे करीब 40 मिनट का समय दे रहे हैं, तो उसमें मुझे पूरी बात रखनी है. But I will try and see how to compress a lot of information. Actually, this lecture is based on a chapter I've just written for a book which will be published by the end of the year. It's a book being put together by scholars all over the world on broadly applied spirituality. So the chapter is very long and it has many more themes than I'm able to compress in this short period of time, but I'll do my best to be able to explain what I'm trying to say. I must also say that this is the first time ever that I'm speaking on this topic. So, your blessings are required for me to be able to do a good job of what I'm going to do. तो अगर हम आज का संदर्भ समझने का प्रयास करते हैं, आज हम किस तरह के संसार में जी रहे हैं, उसमें हमें 3 बातें प्रमुख रूप से दिखाई देती हैं. पहला है पूंजीवाद, दूसरा है पिछले 300 सालों में एक तरह का ज्ञान जो कि पश्चिम से आया है, और उस ज्ञान का वर्चस्व हमें हर जगह नजर आता है। और तीसरा है जो structures of power that we have inherited from the past, essentially patriarchy and the caste system, which embraces a large number of forms of oppression that many people continue to suffer in India and across the world. There is no doubt that capitalism has recorded unprecedented successes. It has often been called the most revolutionary economic system in human history, and I tend to agree with that characterization. But we have to also recognize that these successes have come at an enormous cost. The poor and the historically marginalized have been excluded largely from the benefits of capitalism. And today, the capitalist paradigm has brought us very close to a point of planetary extinction itself. मैं आपसे आज इसलिए बात करने आया हूँ, अरश ने मुझे जो इनविटेशन दिया बाहाई सेंटर ने, मैं उसका बहुत आभारी हूँ, क्योंकि मुझे मालूम है कि इस लेक्चर सीरीज में वो लोग आते हैं जिन्होंने अपना पूरा जीवन, जिस संकट का मैंने उल्लेख किया, उस पूरे जीवन को आपने इस संकट का सामना करने में और आज जो पृथ्वी के सामने जो संकट है उसके लिए कुछ न कुछ करने के लिए आपने अपना पूरा जीवन लगाया है. So I am here to plead with you that for the very survival of the planet, as also for the creation of a just and inclusive society, we need to learn key lessons from the ancient science of spirituality. अगर हमें एक नए समाज का निर्माण करना है और साथ ही अगर हमें अपनी ऊर्जा को भी कायम रखना है, देखिए ये काम ऐसा है जिसमें बहुत तरह की चुनौतियां आती हैं, बहुत सारे चैलेंजेस फेस करने पड़ते हैं, बहुत मुश्किलें आती हैं, और मुझे मालूम है कि आप सब इन मुसीबतों से गुजरे हैं और आपने प्रयास किया है कि अपनी ऊर्जा को, अपनी ताकत को बनाए रखा जाए. तो मेरी इल्तिजा आपसे ये है कि अगर हम इस आध्यात्मिक विज्ञान, इस प्राचीन आध्यात्मिक विज्ञान से कुछ सीखने का प्रयास करें तो हमारी ऊर्जा को भी बनाए रखने में ये बहुत मदद करेगी, क्योंकि उस ऊर्जा की आवश्यकता बहुत हमें लगेगी अगर हमें इस संकट से, इस पृथ्वी को, इस समाज को बाहर निकालना है. तो सबसे पहले प्रेरणा से शुरू करें. I will quote to you Swami Vivekananda from a lecture he gave at the World Parliament of Religions in the United States of America on the 28th of January, 1900. Swamiji said, I accept all religions. I shall go to the mosque of the Mohammedan. I shall enter the Christian's church and kneel before the crucifix. I shall enter the Buddhist temple where I shall take refuge in the Buddha. I shall go into the forest and sit in meditation with the Hindu. Is God's book finished, or is it still a continuous revelation going on? The Bible, the Vedas, the Quran, and all other sacred books are but so many pages, and an infinite number of pages remain yet to be unfolded. I leave my heart open for all of them. मेरा कहना है कि हमें स्वामी जी की इस भावना का सम्मान करते हुए उन सभी परंपराओं की समान इज्जत करनी चाहिए जो हमें एक ही जगह ले जाने का प्रयास कर रहे हैं, लेकिन विभिन्न मार्गों से चलते हुए. अगर हम ऐसा करते हैं तो मुझे लगता है हम इस प्राचीन आध्यात्मिक विज्ञान का लाभ उठा पाएंगे. So why do I call it a science? A lot of people who read my chapter said, you know, we like what you've written, but this insistence on calling it a science, we have a problem with. So I want to briefly touch upon why I would think it is useful to call spirituality a science. Because this knowledge that has been generated over thousands of years is based on repeated and creative experimentation carried out by the pioneers across spiritual traditions. And because it is a paradigm based on experimentation, it is open to all of us to undergo the prescribed practices and decide for ourselves the validity or otherwise of what the ancient science promises us. The aim of spirituality is to provide a pathway towards personal transformation that helps build inner strength of a kind that enables seekers to navigate what the Buddha describes as the inevitable vicissitudes of life: loss and gain, disrepute and fame, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. हम में से कोई भी ऐसा व्यक्ति नहीं है जिनके सामने जिंदगी ने ये सारी चुनौतियां प्रस्तुत नहीं की होंगी। और ये ऐसा विज्ञान है जो हमें ये क्षमता देता है कि हम जीवन के इन उतार चढ़ावों को अच्छी तरह से उनका सामना करते हुए अपनी मंजिल की ओर पूरी हिम्मत के साथ बढ़ते रहे। So as I said, there's a rich diversity of such practices across multiple spiritual traditions. Meditation, pranayama, mantras, rituals, prayers, koan study, martial arts. It's an endless series of experiments that people in different cultures, in different histories, in different traditions have tried out. And I feel there is an equal validity to each one of them. I quoted Swami Vivekananda, he makes a very interesting point. These days we use a word called tolerance. We should have tolerance. It's very interesting. More than 100 years ago, Swamiji argues against tolerance. He said tolerance is not good enough. Tolerance is like tolerating somebody who you don't like. He says we have to speak of acceptance. And that is why he's speaking of embracing all the multiple traditions which are leading in the same direction. तो हमें केवल किसी को सहन नहीं करना, हमें स्वीकार करना है, हमें तहे दिल से स्वीकार करना है उन सभी परंपराओं को जो इस आध्यात्मिक विज्ञान का अंश है. Each tradition invites us to experiment with prescribed practices, and then through our own experience we can decide whether to accept or reject these practices, and the results that they promise, whether they are realized or not, is up to us to ascertain and then to reject if necessary. So the knowledge that the tradition generates is replicable, is verifiable, and it is falsifiable as well. So these are the reasons why I was calling it a science, but I think it's important to understand that this science has certain very distinctive features which we must emphasize. The first feature is विज्ञान की कई विशेषताएं. सबसे पहला ये है कि इसमें जो ज्ञान अर्जित होता है और ज्ञान अर्जन की जो प्रक्रिया है वो दोनों चीजें अनुभव आधारित है. This knowledge is deeply experiential in nature, and there is a rejection of the paradigm of linear unidirectional causality because the central emphasis is on a web of mutual causal interaction, because of which any system is seen as being much greater than the sum of its parts. This leads to a rejection of the Cartesian subject-object duality. The field of pure consciousness can be known only by itself, by consciousness aware of its own unified nature. And the aim of this entire exercise, these scientific experiments, is that the experimenter must herself be transformed. Now, this is again somewhat different from the 300-year-old science in which all of us have been educated, because the experiment is a sadhana, a repeated practice performed with observation and reflection, study and investigation, and it is aimed at inner realization and transformation. So, because its claim is both deeper and more expansive, the ancient science of spirituality, in my view, must be held to an even higher standard of rigor and verifiability. And here is the most important proposition that I want to place before you in this lecture today. When we examine conventional religious morality, as also secular ethics, what we find is that they have been imposed on generations of children, filling them with needless guilt, stress, and confusion. By contrast, and this contrast is very important, spirituality derives its morality from the very nature and structure of reality enunciated by it. So there is a very deep connection between ontology, what we know about being, the being of our existence, ontology and ethics. Ontology and morality are deeply interconnected in the ancient science of spirituality, a connection we don't always find in other more modern systems of morality. And that is the reason I believe that moralizing and this kind of, what I may call ascientific moralizing can often lead to the kinds of disastrous implications for young people and the guilt that they suffer throughout life, etc., etc. Because if you are not going to align yourself with nature, if your morality is going to be something which is, in a way, extremely unnatural, then that will have its own adverse consequences. So that is why I think before we get into what I want to say about the ancient science of spirituality and its implications for policy and practice, I think it is important to understand where organized religion, and this is again across traditions, all organized religion has gone terribly wrong. And here I quote Sri Aurobindo, another one of my great gurus. As Sri Aurobindo says, society has historically used religion, and I quote, to give an august, awful, and would-be eternal sanction to its customs and institutions, made of them a veil of mystery against human questioning and a shield of darkness against the innovator, to catch the human soul and bind it on the wheels of a socio-religious machinery, to impose on it, in the place of spiritual freedom, an imperious yoke and an iron prison. It saddled upon the religious life of man a church, a priesthood, and a mass of ceremonies, and set over it a pack of watchdogs under the name of creeds and dogmas, dogmas which one had to accept and obey under pain of condemnation to eternal hell by an eternal judge beyond. This false socialization of religion has always been the chief cause of its failure to regenerate mankind, unquote. And then Sri Aurobindo goes on to actually say what the spiritual core of religion seeks to do. Neither in the individual nor in the society will it seek to imprison, wall in, repress, impoverish, but to let in the widest air and the highest light. A large liberty will be the law of a spiritual society, and the increase of freedom a sign of the growth of human society towards the possibility of true spiritualization. It is this kind of science of spirituality that we seek to explicate and endorse in this lecture. So before we do that, before we go on to understand what are the founding elements of what I'm calling the science of spirituality, I think we do need to pay attention to the morality of our time. What are the key elements of the existing dominant ideology? वो क्या है जो हम अपने बच्चों को आज सिखा रहे हैं? वो कौन सी नैतिकता है जो आज हम चाहते हैं कि समाज में फैले? जो आज की व्यवस्थाएं हैं वो हमें किस दिशा में लेके जा रही हैं? ये समझना जरूरी है, क्योंकि तभी हम समझ पाएंगे कि मैं इस प्राचीन आध्यात्मिक विज्ञान को इतना महत्व क्यों दे रहा हूं. The first element of this morality, of capitalist morality, is the virtue of selfishness. It is no surprise that one of the most iconic books written and read by almost every young student that I have had the opportunity to teach by Ayn Rand is called The Virtue of Selfishness. Because the creed, the capitalist creed, is that you must only think of yourself, of your own self-interest, and through that, the social interest will be served. So it's a hardcore individualist philosophy where you focus on yourself and yourself alone, And the vision of the self is of Homo economicus, which means the economic man, a person only interested in earning more and more money, part of a competitive, deeply competitive system, fueling endless desires. Because the capitalist machine will only operate if desires remain endless. If you suddenly were to be people who are satisfied with what you have, आप अगर संतोष करने लगेंगे, थोड़ा बहुत कुछ आपकी अगर जरूरतें पूरी हो जाती हैं जीवन की, तो ये पूंजीवाद की जो मशीन है वो काम करना बंद कर देगी. Because it is the endless maximization of profit and accumulation of capital that drives this machinery, and it is founded on this kind of morality. Patriarchy, caste and class superiority is an integral element of what capitalism has inherited from the past and continues to buttress. So we have what sometimes we call intersectionality, that is intersecting forms of power which oppress people, the people who are not, I mean, they don't only oppress actually the people who are subjugated. They, in my view, oppress even the people who are supposedly in positions of power. And the power is also exercised vis-a-vis nature. प्रकृति के ऊपर स्वामित्व आज हमारी विचारधारा का एक बहुत बड़ा अंश है. और प्रकृति के साथ अगर हमारा रिश्ता नहीं बदलेगा, अगर हमारी नैतिकता नहीं बदलेगी, तो इस पृथ्वी को हम लोग बचा नहीं पाएंगे. और ये सारा कुछ जो हम स्वामित्व की बात कर रहे हैं वो आता है ये 300 साल का आधुनिक विज्ञान जो है, जो हमें पश्चिम से मिला है. We are the colonized minds who have uncritically and blindly adopted everything that we have learned from this 300-year-old science. Look, let me clarify. I have a great regard and a great respect for this science. I'm not trying to denigrate the Western science of the last 300 years, which has been responsible for enormous human achievements. But all I am saying is what Michel Foucault once spoke about. He spoke about the insurrection of subjugated knowledges. What we need is to understand that there are many other forms of knowledge which have been repressed by the hegemony exercised by the modern forms of knowledge of the last 300 years. And the outstanding characteristic of these forms of knowledge is what Vandana Shiva, in an immortal phrase, once called monocultures of the mind. And I think it's very important to understand that a lot of our problems, a lot of the difficulties that we face today in the economy, in our interaction with nature, in society, and when we speak of culture, has to do with the hegemonic monocultures of the mind. We impose the same way of living, the same way of eating, the same kind of trees, the same kind of cattle that farmers must have. Everything is supposed to be about the ease of doing business, and ease of doing business is very deeply linked with the monocultures of the mind. So having spoken at length about what is the dominant ideology and morality of our time, I think it's high time we now speak about what the ancient science of spirituality is to say about the same reality which we just described in terms of the hegemonic morality of our time. As I said, the ancient science of spirituality says, understand the nature and structure of reality, understand its constituent elements. Once you do that, you automatically get a morality deriving from that. You automatically know what kind of policies and practices you must have in place if you really understand the structure of reality. So the first element that I'm placing before you is the omnipresence of the divine. Multiple spiritual traditions describe the presence of divinity in all of existence. That the divine is in everyone provides the most profound basis, the ultimate ground for adoption of policies of non-discrimination and the equal rights of all of creation. अगर सब कुछ जो है उसमें ईश्वर है, सब कुछ जो है वो पूजनीय है, अगर सब कुछ जो है वो पूजनीय है, तो किस तरह हम कह सकते हैं कि हमारी नीतियों में और हमारे कार्यों में किसी भी तरह का भेदभाव होना चाहिए, किसी भी तरह का अत्याचार होना चाहिए, जो कि आज हम कर रहे हैं। कास्ट, रेस, कम्युनिटी, रिलीजन, जेंडर, सेक्सुअल ओरिएंटेशन, रीजन, लैंग्वेज, all of these are the axes of power on the basis of which the morality of the time is justifying discrimination and oppression on the grounds of inferiority and superiority, when actually we all know, or at least if we did understand the ancient science of spirituality, we would know that there is divinity in everything. Once we see all things as sacred, our entire relationship with them is profoundly transformed. The human, the material, and the natural world are not then seen as mere instruments for exploitation, but as invaluable in themselves. This completely changes the way we conceive our relationship with the world and our policies and practices in the world. We no longer seek domination and control, but try to achieve harmony and balance in what we do. So harmony and balance become the founding pillars of a morality based on the ancient science of spirituality. The second element of the structure of reality, which the ancient science of spirituality places before us, is interconnectedness and diversity of all existence. As the great Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh says, and I quote, "For a table to exist, we need wood, a carpenter, time, skillfulness, and many other causes. The wood needs the forest, the sunshine, the rain, and so on. Looking deeply at the sunshine, the leaves of the tree, and the clouds, we can see the table. The one can be seen in the all, and the all can be seen in the one." Unquote. Understanding this interconnectedness and diversity transforms the very nature of policy and practice. And I will, in the next few minutes, illustrate this point with concrete examples taken from the sectors I'm most familiar with, which is water and agriculture. आप सबने अली सरदार जाफरी की नज्म सुनी होगी, कौन आजाद हुआ, किसके माथे से सियाही छूटी, मेरे सीने में अभी दर्द है महकूमी का, मादरे हिंद के चेहरे पे उदासी है बड़ी। तो हमें सोचना है कि ये महकूमी आप समझते हैं, महकूमी मतलब गुलामी, सर्विट्यूड। ये महकूमी और ये उदासी कहां से पैदा हो, इसके बारे में सोचना जरूरी है। क्योंकि एक समाज जहां इतनी असमानता, इतने प्रकार का शोषण हो, उस समाज में जब तक शोषक वर्ग की आजादी पे अंकुश न लगाया जाए, तब तक शोषित वर्ग की आजादी असंभव है। Thus, the freedom of men, the rich, the upper caste must be kept in check if we are to ensure the well-being of women, the poor, and the marginalized. And we have examples of that right from the time of independence. Programs for land reform, redistributive taxation, and affirmative action, all of these are under great scrutiny and question right now in the world that we live in. As also the laws against sexual harassment are all examples of restraint being a condition for freedom itself. Perhaps the most important example is the Indian Constitution itself, which restrains acts of parliament that militate against the basic structure of the Constitution, thus firmly circumscribing a possible tyranny of the majority. So majoritarianism also has to be kept in check and can only happen if we understand one of the fundamental principles of the ancient science of spirituality, which is that restraint is a fundamental requirement for the freedom of all. But the deepest source of unfreedom is what the ancient science alerts us to the most. जब हम महकूमी की बात करते हैं और उदासी की बात करते हैं, हमें यह देखना होगा कि इसकी सबसे गहरी जड़ कहां पे, ये सबसे ज्यादा कहां से पैदा होती है। एंड देन वी रियलाइज that we must not remain caught in the endless cycle of desire, fulfillment, and lack, because that becomes an eternal source of bondage and unfreedom, even enslavement, more overpowering than any external servitude. तो एक है शोषण जो बाहर से होता है. There are external causes of our servitude, which we alluded to. But there are also internal causes. If we continue to fuel the capitalist machine of endless greed and endless selfishness, we will cause nothing but suffering, not only to others, but even to ourselves. So, what I wanted to do now, having just very briefly alluded to the fundamental features of the ancient science of spirituality, let me now illustrate to you, in the few minutes that I have, how learning from the ancient science of spirituality can completely alter the way we undertake policy and practice in our time. If finitude is indeed a fundamental aspect of our existence, if our knowledge is bound to be both limited and uncertain, we must ensure that the process of policy making reflects and acknowledges this reality. So what I will do is to illustrate how the very process of policy making must change if we learn the right lessons from the ancient science of spirituality. The very first is the rejection of all fundamentalisms. Because if you see, policy in our time has been completely flooded by one kind of fundamentalism or the other. And the aspiration for which leads to a suppression of dissent, inquiry, and the sense of wonder and mystery, which has to be the beginning of all science, and if I may say so, the beginning of all policy. Do we retain that sense of wonder, of the unknown, when we formulate our policies, when we formulate our programs? And I'm not only talking of governments, मैं आप सबकी बात कर रहा हूं, हम सब लोग जो समाज में परिवर्तन लाने का प्रयास कर रहे हैं, क्या हम वो विनम्रता अपने अंदर रखते हैं, बनाए रखते हैं, जो हमें सही रास्ते पे ले जाएगी? नहीं तो हम उससे भटकना हमारा तय है. So the second element after rejection of fundamentalism, which naturally follows, is the valorization of nimble-footedness. Policy making therefore requires an openness to mid-course correction as new knowledge is acquired and fresh experience is gained over time. हर समय हमें ये प्रयास करना है कि हम कोई नई चीज सीख रहे हैं, और नई चीज जब हम सीखते हैं तो हमें अपने पुराने तरीकों को लगातार बदलने के लिए तैयार रहना, वो विनम्रता अपने अंदर रखना बहुत जरूरी है. The third element is the criticality of dialogue. An acknowledgement of finitude necessitates deep listening, respecting a diversity of approaches and standards. Dialogue is a corrective to the stridency of both the bottom-up activist and the top-down planner. What enlightens is deep dialogue, an engagement from which something unanticipatable, something novel emerges and guides action. हम कुछ भी करें, हम कोई भी नीति बनाएं, हम कोई भी काम करने जाएं, उसमें संवाद को हमें अपना केंद्र बिंदु मानना है. जब तक हम संवाद में नहीं उतर पाते, जिन लोगों के साथ हम काम करते हैं, क्या हम उनके साथ एक इज्जत भरा संवाद स्थापित कर पाते हैं? क्या हम उनकी बात सुनते हैं? और उस बात को सुनने के बाद क्या कुछ नया हमारे सामने आता है? ये चीज हमें सीखनी है प्राचीन आध्यात्मिक विज्ञान से. As the Franciscan friar Richard Rohr argues, transformational change comes only from those who, and I quote, live on the edge of the insight. So this is a very interesting point. I would urge all of you to pay careful attention. Living on the edge of the inside means you have learned the rules well enough to know how to break the rules properly, which is not really to break them at all, but to find their true purpose. We can never defeat the ossification of bureaucracy unless we know how to work with rules creatively. And this also means that we cannot be content to be mere critics from the outside. We must always strive to bring about real change through constructive, critical engagement with those in power. And Richard says, not an outsider throwing rocks, nor a comfortable insider who defends the status quo, but one, we need to aspire to be one who lives precariously with two perspectives held tightly together. It's a very exciting journey that the ancient science of spirituality is before us. Because, dogmatism, fundamentalism is dull. A monologue is dull. What really enlivens life is this kind of dialogue, this kind of precarity, which Richard Rohr urges us to embrace. So now, finally, what I will do in the last part of my lecture is to give you concrete illustrations of how I have tried to incorporate these learnings from the ancient science of spirituality in the little experience that I've had in shaping water policy in India to begin. Now, the tragedy is that water policies and programs all over the world throughout the 20th century were formulated ignoring the interconnections between different elements of the water cycle. Remember one of the fundamental features of the structure of reality that the ancient science of spirituality teaches us is interconnectedness. And the water cycle is the best example of that. Groundwater is a shared common pool resource. If we use groundwater on the basis of the existing morality of our time, which is individualism, unbridled competitiveness, endless greed, selfishness, groundwater will be destroyed, has been destroyed. So groundwater is a shared common pool resource. If I extract groundwater below my land, I impact the access to this groundwater for those who share the aquifer. Unfortunately, given the dominant ideology of our time, both our legal and economic systems are designed to incentivize atomistic overexploitation of groundwater to such an extent that a more powerful extractor can eliminate access for others to even their water for life. Policy has also not acknowledged the flow of water in our peninsular rivers after the monsoon comes from groundwater. So different elements of the water cycle are interconnected with each other. हमारी जो नदियां हैं, वर्षा के बाद वो सूख क्यों जाती? आज हमारी नदियां क्यों सूख रही? क्योंकि हम ये भूल गए हैं कि वर्षा के बाद नदी का पानी भूजल से प्राप्त होता है और हमने भूजल को इतनी तेजी से जमीन से बाहर निकाला है कि उसका स्तर इतना नीचा हो गया है कि नदियों का पानी अब जमीन के नीचे जा रहा है, न कि जो भूजल था, जो नदी को पानी देता था, वो समाप्त होता जा रहा है। सो एक के बाद एक हमारी नदियां सूखती जा रही हैं। उसका सिंपल कारण ये है कि हम भूल गए हैं जो अंतर संबंध है विभिन्न भागों का इस जल चक्र का, और यही बात हमें प्राचीन आध्यात्मिक विज्ञान याद दिला रहा है। The plan to link India's Himalayan rivers with its peninsular rivers could have a disastrous impact on the very integrity of the monsoon cycle. The presence of a low salinity layer of water with low density is a reason for maintenance of high sea surface temperatures in the Bay of Bengal, which contributes to low pressure areas and the intensification of monsoon activity. आज हम नदियों को जोड़ने की जो परियोजना की सोच रहे हैं, उससे क्या होगा कि नदी समुद्र तक नहीं पहुंच पाएगी, और जब नदी समुद्र तक नहीं पहुंचेगी तो जो मीठा पानी है नदी का, जो कि हमारी मॉनसून को उत्तेजित करने के लिए बहुत बहुत जरूरी है, वो समुद्र को नहीं मिल पाएगा और हमारे भारतीय उपमहाद्वीप में जीवन संकट में पड़ जाएगा। ये पूरी संभावना है अगर हम आध्यात्मिक प्राचीन विज्ञान से ये सीख नहीं सीखेंगे कि हम जब स्वामी बनने चले हैं पृथ्वी के, अगर हम निर्मलता को खो देंगे तो ये पृथ्वी और हमारा जीवन बर्बाद हो जाएगा। वही चीज हम लोग सीख सकते हैं हमारी खेती से। जो हम आज खेती कर रहे हैं उसमें बहुत बड़ा परिवर्तन लाना जरूरी है। Attempts are being made all over the world to foster higher sustainability and resilience, lower costs of production, as also economy in water use and farming. Essentially, this is an attempt to redefine our relationship with nature, where we seek to weave our interventions into the contours of nature rather than seeking mastery over it. Sadly, however, in farming as in water, we have attempted complete control over nature rather than seeking to align with it and harnessing its power. So many of the present diseases that we see, and I have quoted Kate Brown, I will not read it out for the sake of economy of time, but जो आज कोविड की महामारी आई है हमारे बीच, उसका मुख्य कारण यही बता रहे हैं वैज्ञानिक कि हमने प्रकृति का इतना घोर उल्लंघन किया है कि आज प्रकृति हमें वो सहारा नहीं दे पा रही जो उसने दिया है इन हजारों सालों में, क्योंकि हमने उसका बहुत बड़ा उल्लंघन किया। और ये सारी बीमारियां जो आपके सामने जिनकी सूची है वो सभी इसलिए आ गई हैं क्योंकि हम एक रासायनिक खेती जो पिछले कुछ ही सालों की देन है उसको हमने इतना ज्यादा व्यापक हमारी पृथ्वी पे कर दिया है। Biologists have begun questioning the idea that each tree is an individual. It might be more accurately understood as a node in a network of underworld exchanges between fungi, roots, bacteria, lichen, insects, and other plants. The network is so intricate that it's difficult to say where one organism ends and the other begins. This requires understanding complex adaptive systems, where the behavior of the whole system cannot be grasped by an understanding of its separate individual parts. This is nothing if not a reiteration of the fundamental insights of the ancient science of spirituality. The last illustration I want to give you is from the sphere of politics. Meaningful politics in an unjust society comprises any endeavor to alter the balance of power in favor of the deprived and oppressed. How radical such an attempt is turns on how far-reaching a challenge is mounted to these structures of power. A truly radical politics must seek a transformation that is much more fundamental than the ones sought by what one may call the more sectarian movements. Each of these is undoubtedly invaluable in themselves, but finally gets limited to a specific structure of power, whether based on gender, class, caste, race, region, or community. Experiencing freedom, however, at the deepest level demands reimagining the relationship between the personal and the political. While political movements for social change have tended to neglect the personal, the religious traditions have in the main neglected attention to the social sphere. Indeed, they have often been used by the powers that be to buttress structures of power in society. Both the political movements and the religious traditions need to change. The political movements need to understand that without a radical transformation of basic human aspirations, a just and sustainable social order cannot be created. Likewise, religious traditions must see how oppressive social and economic structures are a formidable obstacle to the divinization of life on earth. A bridge needs to be built between the two sides, a bridge that is longer, deeper, and stronger than anything we have seen thus far. Spiritual political activists like Gandhi, Ambedkar, Paulo Freire, Martin Luther King, Thich Nhat Hanh, Bell Hooks, and many, many others have embodied a politics of this kind in our time. This pantheon of great thinker activists centered their politics and attempts at social transformation around a spiritual understanding of the world. They brought to bear reconstructed spiritual resources from different traditions to address what they saw as the key challenges of their own time and context. Careful attention needs to be paid here to Martin Luther King, who brilliantly formulated the relationship between love, power, and justice. King questions the legacy of viewing love and power as polar opposites, where love appears as a rescinding of power and power as a rejection of love. That is how we have commonly understood these words. But what King tells us is that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. And this new understanding of power helps King positively formulate the unbreakable bond between love, power, and justice. And King says, power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. I don't think you will get a better summary of the kind of radical politics that we need in the 20th century, 21st century, to save this planet and to create a very new kind of society. So as I conclude, I thought I will summarize the major propositions of this lecture. Capitalism has proved to be the most efficient economic machine to deliver goals based on human acquisitiveness, unbridled competitiveness, and greed. But can a world based on liberty, equality, and fraternity be founded within a capitalist framework which has generated vast inequality, much needless deprivation, and brought the earth close to extinction? And if we are seeking alternatives to capitalism, can these be built merely on programs for social and political change without transforming individual aspirations? The champions of technology, the free market, and the totalitarian state each peddled their own fundamentalisms throughout the 20th century. Each one of them, each in their own ways, have pushed the planet perilously close to annihilation. If our fundamental aspirations are not altered, if we continue to seek endless joy in external sources, then our suffering and that of the planet will not end. Our challenge is not to allow the undeniable darknesses of the time to overwhelm us, but to seize the light that still shines within. The aim of this lecture has been to remind us of what we need to urgently learn from the ancient science of spirituality, especially about the relationships humans must have with each other, as also with all other creatures on the planet and with the planet itself. The ancient science of spirituality offers an alternative path of humility, freedom, creativity, and joy. Humanity and stewardship of the earth would do well to heed this counsel before it is too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Shah, for this really thought-provoking and profound lecture. We have little time, so I'll quickly go to the questions. There is a question from an anonymous source which says, how do we arrive at a common understanding of spiritual reality? How do we arrive at a common paradigm? How to differentiate this science from pseudoscience? How do we differentiate a subjective view from an objective observation of reality? I guess the questioner is referring to the science of spirituality here and saying, what is the pseudoscience of this science? What is the objective reality?
So, you want to take up, we can have, just tell
you
me.
want all of them? Okay.
I mean,
so the next question is, why is it ancient science? How can we not generate new knowledge?
Okay.
Then another question, this was a question from Raja Singh. Another from Chetan Parikh says, dear Professor Shah, your talk is amazingly convincing, persuasive, and rational. Thank you very much. Here is a question. You said that both political and religious systems need to change. How do you think such a world-transforming change can come about? Or if we are to learn from history, how have such changes come about in the history of humanity?
So I think that's a load of questions. No, I think they're all very, very important questions. I think to arrive at a common paradigm, is really the task, in a sense, when I quoted Swami Vivekananda, I mean, that's what he was trying to do. A lot of effort is actually ongoing even as we speak to arrive at that. Many people, including the Dalai Lama, including, activists across the world, they are all trying to engage in this kind of dialogue across religious traditions. So I think already there is a lot of work which shows that we can arrive at certain common elements. I mean, the idea is not to, in fact, discount differences. I think the differences are extremely powerful and they're enriching. In fact, that's the precise point of the ancient science of spirituality, that it valorizes diversity. But diversity should not, lead to attitudes of contempt and intolerance, which we have seen. Rather, they should be founded on mutual respect and regard for different traditions. Essentially, what Ramakrishna Paramahans said, "Joto mat, toto path." Jitne mat hai, utne hi path hai. So the point is not to say my way or the highway, but to respect the different elements in different traditions and their respective relevance for different kinds of people. And without that, we will not be able to arrive at the common paradigm. Ancient versus modern, I think it's a good question. I don't think there's anything ancient necessarily about it. A lot of people would say eternal, actually, because it's as modern as anything that exists around us. I think I have deliberately, in a slightly provocative manner, chosen the term ancient because I wanted to valorize the ancient, as much as we valorize anything that is modern. Because for us, all of us, हम सब ये सोचते हैं कि जो आधुनिक है वो अच्छा है. तो मैंने जानबूझ के प्राचीन शब्द का शायद इस्तेमाल किया, लेकिन आप इसको आधुनिक विज्ञान भी कह सकते हैं, बिल्कुल कह सकते हैं. और मुझे लगता है कि आधुनिक विज्ञान और इस प्राचीन विज्ञान के बीच में भी संवाद संभव है, आज हो भी रहा है, लेकिन उसकी और भी ज्यादा आवश्यकता है. Having combined the three questions, I have now the third question has slipped my mind. So one should always know what one is capable of before deciding to do things. So what was the third question?
You said that both political and religious systems need to change. How do you think such a world transforming change can come about? Or if we are to learn from history, how such changes come about in history?
I got it. Yeah, so I think, that is why in this paper that I have written, I have actually tried to put together this, what I call the pantheon of spiritual political activists. Whether it's Gandhi, whether it's Ambedkar, Martin Luther King, Paulo Freire, the theology of liberation in Latin America, all of these people, Bell Hooks today, Thich Nhat Hanh, a lot of the modern activists, many of them, who are atheists, who are feminists in a certain way, a conventional feminist way, have today become spiritual in their perspectives. And the other way around has also happened. Many people who are religious have realized that, for example, Richard Rohr, who I have quoted in this lecture, is a Franciscan friar in America, and he is doing extraordinary work. His center is called the Center for Action and Contemplation. And he puts action before contemplation. So they teach meditation, of course, in that center, but they constantly link all spiritual practices to the larger political project of political transformation, of addressing the structures of power in society. If we take the example of Jesus himself, I mean, he was, and actually all of the pioneers of these religious traditions, they were social revolutionaries in their time. They worked with the marginalized, they worked with the poor and the oppressed. The difficulty is that these religious traditions have forgotten the political roots that lay at their origins. And by political, I simply mean they were all people questioning the structures of power in society in their time.
Thank you. There's a question from Caroline Fazli. Dear Professor, you shared your critique of capitalism, so I would be interested in knowing your thoughts on what would be characteristics of an economic system that enshrines spiritual values and social justice.
So Caroline, that's a huge question. I've tried to actually answer this, and a lot of people working today, I'll suggest scholars like Mariana Mazzucato. These are people who are already doing that. What they're saying is how we can have a more green economy, how we can have a more caring economy, where the principles that I have just outlined, where communities come together. So you're democratizing the state, you are transforming the policies of the state in a direction which aligns much more with the ancient science of spirituality. And incidentally, that makes perfect economic sense. So in my chapter, which I didn't speak about today, I talk a lot about the work of Keynes himself. You know, the greatest economist of the 20th century. His work actually shows the complementarity of interests of different classes in society. And that is what, again, we are now trying to understand through the, once the entire free market fundamentalism has got discredited after the 2008 financial crisis and so on, the world is now, the policies that are coming about in many countries across the world are reflecting the realization that interconnectedness has to be seen as a basic principle of economic policy and of policy concerning sectors such as water, agriculture, etc., which I talked about. It's a large question, but I think these are the indications I wanted to give you of the directions in which economic and social policy must move.
There's a question from Rahul Jain. It's great to valorize ancient knowledge. It deserves due credence. But its weaknesses, especially in terms of being limited in the research methods available at that time, also need to be called out vociferously. Buddha and Vedas might have also found a lot of scientific knowledge which stands true today, but they did not have basic scientific research methods and tools, such as telescope, microscope, to translate the understanding of these eternal phenomena. These eternal truths must be adapted with modern scientific methods. How can we do that in the most effective and non-alienating way?
Yeah, well, Rahul, I think a lot of the answer to your own question is in the question itself. And I would say it should be done in a non-alienating way. So don't call out and don't use language which is either derisive of the ancient science or of the modern science. I would not do that. I would say exactly what you're saying. And that is what a lot of spiritual activists are attempting today, to use the resources available today through the efforts of the modern science of the last 300 years to actually build a dialogue between the practices that the ancient science had. I wouldn't say that one is more powerful than the other. That, the jury is still out on that. Because unless we study the practices and, what you're calling technology, there is a huge technology in that ancient science. I have written in my chapter that I am highly ignorant of most of, what I'm trying to talk about. So with that caveat, I think we must have the humility to understand that we still have not explored all the possibilities and all the resources available to the ancient science. But I totally agree with you. The idea is not to, this is not a war going on and who's getting it's not a beauty contest where we're trying to give the first prize. Actually, we are all trying to, address the questions of human suffering and, attainment of freedom and joy. And whatever enables that must be, placed in the service of enabling that. That's the way I would answer that. But anything that militates against it, whether it is fundamentalism based, the way the charlatans have come and disgraced the ancient science of spirituality. That's why we have a rationalist movement in India. I highly respect the rationalist movement in India, which is calling out the charlatans of the ancient science. And the same way, everyone is watching Oppenheimer right now, so I don't need to talk about the disastrous impact of modern science and technology on the planet and on the well-being of everyone. So recognizing where we are going wrong, it becomes very easy when we take the foundational principles of the ancient science and make them the guideposts. What will guide our journey forward? Love and harmony, love, power, and justice as enunciated by Martin Luther King. These are fantastic formulations. If we make them the founding, building blocks of whatever policy and practice we undertake, I don't think we'll go wrong.
Many contemporary spiritual leaders, this is from Rajesh Ramakrishnan, many contemporary spiritual leaders, far from talking of curbing the freedom of the powerful, are preaching spirituality to them, with the assumption that if they are transformed, the world can be transformed more easily. Is this valid, or is it the co-option of spirituality?
No, I am very acutely conscious, Rajesh, of the co-option of spirituality. I think there's a problem. Of course, I think everyone should benefit from spiritual transformation. But if we say that merely spiritually transforming the oppressors is good enough, I would totally disagree. Because I think there is a social and political project which must go on, which must be, as I said, and that's the main theme of my lecture, that these two must be integrated. One is not enough. Both are necessary, but neither is sufficient. So we need both, and therefore the actions of all the political movements that I referred to are extremely important. But I'm saying, without spiritualizing those movements, the people who are part of those movements get exhausted. The kind of burnout that is happening amongst all of us. I mean, we've all gone through this, burnout as activists on the ground. And I think to build your inner resources, to be able to fight the good fight, but it's a fight with a difference, because we are not trying to destroy anybody. The fight is for creation of a new social order. No one has put it better than Baba Sahib Ambedkar. So I would just refer you to, he was not a Buddhist in a purely strategic sense. He was a deeply believing Buddhist, because he realized through his own experience of social and political movements how corrosive they can become without an internal spiritual transformation of the activists of those movements. So just to come back to answering just specifically your question, I think we need a transformation in social and economic systems, and that task is not only about spiritually transforming the oppressors.
There's a question from Vipul Bharadwaj. What will be the solution of Nadi Pariyojana? If we don't implement Nadi Jodo Pariyojana, then the whole irrigation process will is in danger. That's his question? If you want to respond.
So, Vipul, मैं आपको ये पढ़ाने वाला हूँ बहुत विस्तार से. जब आप शिव नाडर यूनिवर्सिटी में आएंगे तो मैं अभी पूरा जवाब नहीं दूंगा, लेकिन इतना मैं आपको बता दूं कि अगर हमने नदी जोड़ परियोजना की, और मैं उसको पूरी डिटेल में नहीं समझा पाया आज, तो हमारी मॉनसून साइकिल ही डिस्ट्रॉय हो गई. तो विध्वंस से बचना पहले बहुत जरूरी है. थोड़ा दिमाग लगाना. इरिगेशन न रहेगा बांस, न बजेगी बांसुरी. मॉनसून ही नहीं रहेगा तो हमारा सिंचाई तो दूर, हमारा जीवन खतरे में पड़ जाएगा. I'll reserve the longer answer to that question for later.
Thank you, Professor. I have a question.
Yes,
during the Enlightenment in Western history, there was a reaction to religion, right? So and ever since there's been this separation of science and religion. Now the question in my mind is, now the way you are framing the science of spirituality, how does one navigate those tricky areas where the science of, let's say, materialism or the natural sciences or the social sciences articulate the ontological belief that they are based on don't agree with the ontological assumptions of spirituality? For example, this creationism, the whole debate around creationism, that's just one, but one can think of so many things where then the scientific establishment begins to say this is superstition, this is just subjective,
yes,
assumptions. So it would just be helpful to hear your thoughts.
Yes. No, it's a fantastic question, Arish, because again, the use of the word science in the title of the lecture is also a deliberate, slightly provocative sort of device on my part. But for exactly the reason that you have just enunciated, it is for exactly that reason. Because I believe actually that the Enlightenment was about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And that is really what I'm cautioning against. As scientists, as people who are rational, as people who want human progress, I think we should always look for what would lead to greater freedom, to greater joy, to greater harmony in society. I don't think Oppenheimer didn't want to destroy the world, right? He was trying to end war. So I don't think any scientist worth his salt. I mean, of course, there are those scientists who are only in the service of profit-making companies, and we leave that aside. That cannot qualify as a project of science in the deepest sense of the term. So I think what happened in the Enlightenment is that we correctly rejected not only unscientific, superstitious practices, but the power of the church. I mean, the church has been the most oppressive institution in human history. And, I've written about it in the larger chapter, and all churches have. So I think it was very important for liberty, equality, and fraternity for us to reject that complete, control over everything, over production, over Galileo and over Newton. I mean, that was very, very important. And these are very important milestones in the history of freedom. But what we should not have done, and the mistake that Western science repeatedly makes and continues to make, is to arrogate to itself the fact that you are the only source of knowledge and that every other paradigm is necessarily by definition inferior, without even investigating those paradigms in a scientific spirit. So I am just reading the spirit of science to to people like you, if I may say so. Anyone who believes in science, I absolutely believe in science. I believe that modern science has greatly contributed to the improvement of human welfare. But it must remain true to the spirit of science. And doing that enables you to have an openness, a sense of wonder, a sense of mystery, a sense of humility, a sense of awe about what you don't know. That's how all science has progressed. I mean, if we were not scientific, we would have stuck to the Newtonian vision of the world and not embraced what Einstein taught us, right? So it's not that science is frozen in time. Our frontiers are expanding. And I would say, and that's why the question about modern and ancient is a good one. I think the ancient science holds the future of science, because that's where, when we will understand human consciousness, when we will understand the unexplored regions of the brain. This is modern neuroscience admits that they know very little about the functioning of the human brain. But I think when we have a dialogue between the yogis, between the rishis, between people who are trying to explore unexplored regions of the brain, there is huge, it's full of possibilities, the kind of possibilities that Rahul Jain asked in his question about. Sky is the limit. And that's what also boundlessness is one of the founding principles of the ancient science of spirituality. It is about abundance, and that's what that kind of dialogue would enable. Dialogue would have to be non-fundamentalist, non-superstitious. It would have to be based on experimentation. So as someone asked earlier, what are the basic elements? These are the elements which not only will unite all forms of spirituality, but also spirituality and science. Let's agree on procedures, on parameters, and then sky is the limit.
Thank you so much, Professor Shah, for this excellent, really thought-provoking and very profound journey that you've really taken us on. And I think many of us, I'm sure we still have questions, and I think that's probably the intention of the lecture as well, to provoke us to begin to think along these pathways which we are not accustomed to doing, and to learn, to advance our thinking and understanding about how spirituality has a very profound bearing on the future of humanity. And we couldn't have had a better initiation into that path of thinking and understanding. I'd like to thank Professor Shah and also all our esteemed participants who've joined us today on Zoom as well as on Facebook. Thank you everyone for your comments, your questions. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to continue this discussion. I'm sure we could have gone on much further.
Arash, I just wanted to say two things. One is that they could not have been a better place for me to say this than the Baha'i Center. So I must thank you for all the efforts that all of you and your team have made over the years, because that's really, I feel I'm, at home when I'm speaking with you. I also wanted to say that if there are other questions, I have actually 10 more minutes. So I have no problem if there are questions which are already there and somebody wants to ask. Otherwise, we can continue.
Sure, we can keep the webinar on for maybe another 10 minutes and take more questions. So friends, Professor Shah has very graciously given us more time. So please do ask your questions and share your thoughts. While we wait, Professor, if you will indulge me, I have another question.
Yes.
You know, when you spoke of avoiding fundamentalism, that was very clear as something, one of the core principles in a sense. But then the question in my mind was the other extreme, is how do we avoid the charge of relativism? That now we're in a sense, like I think you discussed this in your previous comment, where you said we have to come to an agreement about a set of procedures. But basically, it's just a question of how does one ensure that in the name of experimentation, learning through experimentation, we don't have a scenario where everything goes.
Right. So, you've asked the basic question of science, right? This is what the fundamental question of philosophy of science is, exactly what you just stated. Because you don't want to be dogmatic, you don't want to be not open to new facts and new discoveries, but it's not that anything goes. I think the simple, and there's a danger precisely because those who are primarily responsible for destroying the planet and its resources would say, well, we are also experimenting and, you should go by what we are. So I think the important thing is to again reiterate what the goal is and what the data shows. For example, Mr. Trump denies climate change. So, that way, of course, you can deny it, but, there has to be an agreement on a certain framework of evidence which we all acknowledge and agree upon. And in spirituality, this becomes very complicated, as I said, because the transformation is internal. But the fact is, even if I am being internally transformed, my behavior can be seen and recorded by those who I work with or interact with or my family, etc. So I think there are ways in which we can't say anything goes. So long as we are agreed on the goals, we have agreed on the indicators, so to speak, as a lot of people who are listening to this lecture will be familiar with the language. So the indicators are there, the goals are agreed. And I think then you can see that this method or this path is doing well or is not doing well. And on that basis, I think relativism, relativism is a very powerful, a very important, necessary corrective to the fundamentalism of dogmatic and hegemonic science. But clearly, as you said, it's not a free for all, which would then become, this is what postmodernism is about. So I firmly reject postmodernism, if you like. They can definitely indulge in what they want to do, but so long as if they are not agreed on the goals that we should all commit to, then I don't find that of much interest. Let's put it that way.
Thank you, Professor. There's a question: when will the day come when the people in power will provide justice and spread love and not war? In other words, the activists among us, those who are, the part of the convinced, part of those who are, the problem is not with them. The problem is with those who are in power and who are part of the order that is actually creating the challenges, destroying the environment. How does that change come about? And I think your discussion of social transformation, the personal and the to some extent touched upon it, but it would be helpful if you could elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, see, even though there's a science of astrology, it's an extremely complicated science, and I certainly am not even don't know so I don't know when it will come, and we cannot answer that question, really speaking. What we can do is to see what will contribute towards making that change more possible than it is today. And there I'm actually saying, I'm not saying, as somebody very nicely, Rajesh, asked that question, I think that it's not just about spiritual transformation of those in power and saying that, oh, they will now start becoming people who are loving rather than hateful or greedy or accumulating profit or building houses with 27 floors for themselves, etc. That is certainly part of the change. I'm not saying that's not important, but definitely all our social movements, all the movements around all the axes of power are extremely important, because they are not going to just go, easy. I mean, so we need to do that. But what I'm saying is, when we have these movements, because we've had these movements, right? We are all being part of so many movements for social justice, for ecological restoration, for gender justice. But the problem is, we are also getting exhausted. We are using a language which is also destroying our inner core. And how are we with our own colleagues? So what is the strength of our own movements? And what I'm saying is, the spiritual science actually helps us, gives us resources through which we can strengthen that which we require, the stamina that we need to have, the energy that we need to have to continue with these struggles for social justice and social change. And once we do that, you are embodying the change that you're trying to bring about in society. So you can actually be examples for those who are also suffering. I mean, those who oppress others suffer very deeply as well. So this politics of integrity, if I may call it, where the personal and the political are going together, where the inner and social transformation is happening together, offers a very new kind of politics and a new kind of spirituality to the world. And I think all of us should try and work together to make that happen.
Professor, there are two more questions. One is, what is the place of religious leadership? Because traditionally there has been this group, historically, the yogis or the fathers or the mullahs, who have interpreted the spiritual ideas and teachings for, and they continue to wield a lot of influence. Is it time to move beyond that paradigm of the guru and the shishya, or is that part of the wisdom that we don't want to lose?
देखिए, हमारी परंपरा में बहुत साफ शब्दों में कहा गया है कि गुरु करिए जान के. A guru is very important. गुरु आपको बहुत लाभ दे सकता है, लेकिन आपको गुरु का चयन सही तरह से करना पड़ेगा. वो भी परंपरा में सिखाया गया, वो भी आध्यात्मिक विज्ञान में बताया गया कि एक असली गुरु के क्या चिन्ह होते हैं. The difficulty with the religious leaders that, some of them that you're talking about, is that, and this is again historically true, the church played that role, the Brahmins played that role in, our own civilization, that the religious texts were used to justify the status quo, to justify the oppression of, those who are excluded. And that has been why political movements or radical political movements have moved away from religion. And that's what I'm saying. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater to even these people. What I'm saying is, you are right. There have been religious leaders, there have been religious institutions which have misused their power. And by the way, Sri Aurobindo is the greatest critic of that whole tradition. I'm citing him because he belongs to the tradition, often is quoted by people. Even now, he's one of the contemporary heroes of certain movements. And I'm glad he's a hero, but I would urge those people to really read what he has taught about the role of religious power and how it has been used to buttress oppression in society. So what I'm saying is, religious leadership has a very important role, so long as it is true to the tradition. My point is that people have gone away completely from the fundamental goals enunciated in the fundamental texts of all these traditions. And I think we need, that's why, one of my passions is that there have to be places where young people can access these resources in their authenticity and not in their distorted form where half the godmen of our time are in jail. I mean, I'm very happy they are in jail because they are the ones harming the tradition and its power the most. But what I'm urging my friends among the activist groups is that don't equate the power of the spiritual tradition with a few people who have distorted it. Because that's true of all movements. It's true of radical movements as well. I mean, what has happened in Stalin's Soviet Union and Mao's China, nobody can have blinkers about it anymore. So who are we trying to, show the mirror to? I think we need to recognize things when they go wrong in every tradition and steer clear of those mistakes.
Professor, maybe the last question, this is from Kumra Neeraj Kumar. In a capitalist majority world, when one starts to bring these selfless ideas for the common good, it may make others think that this is something useless. Again, ignoring them and moving on is a spiritual idea, but it gets tough to practice. So how to look at this problem?
Now, बहुत अच्छा सवाल है और I think you have captured the challenge absolutely correctly. I mean, that's why I had that slide on the morality of our time. आज माँ बाप बच्चों को बोल रहे हैं कि अपने नोट्स किसी बच्चे से शेयर मत करना बिकॉज तेरे को फर्स्ट पे आना है. So sharing is not a virtue that we are teaching our children. We are teaching them to go ahead, get ahead. But you know, change comes about only when people challenge these dominant ideologies. That's how society has moved forward. That's the only way it can move forward. So I agree that it's difficult, but let's take inspiration from all the gurus, from Kabir to Nanak to Raidas to Tukaram. I mean, there have been people who have taught society how to look at society differently. I'm not naming Gandhi and Ambedkar here because we've already talked about them. So I think what we need to do is to strengthen communities based on a different form of living. That's how change has always come about in society. The big movements that have happened, the communities that have been created based on different principles. And it's happening even within capitalism. It's happening. The Mondragon cooperatives in Spain are an inspiring example of running successful industry, deviating from the principles of free market fundamentalism. So there are possibilities, and there are many other examples. People who are practicing agroecological farming, etc. There are thousands of examples like that. And I think the important thing is to learn from these examples and to design strategies to scale these examples so that they can impact the largest number of people.
Thank you so much, Professor, and again, thank you to the participants. I think it's time now to bring this wonderful discussion to a close. Friends, the recording of this discussion will be shared with you. It will be shared on our YouTube channel, and you can of course share it with your friends and contacts who would be interested in a discussion of this nature. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. It was a wonderful experience. Thank you so much.